Hello, and welcome to the Sound Health Network's webinar series. I'm Indre Viscontis. I'm your host and moderator for today's event. The Sound Health Network is led by co-directors Julene Johnson and Charles Lim, who also composed our introductory music, and music therapist Sherry Robb and I round out the leadership team. Our mission is to promote research and public awareness about the impact of music on health and wellness. The Sound Health Network is a partnership of the National Endowment for the Arts with the University of California, San Francisco, in collaboration with the National Institutes of Health, the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts, and Renée Fleming. Feel free to introduce yourselves and post questions in the chat. This webinar series features interdisciplinary conversations between researchers and other stakeholders in our community, representing diverse perspectives and addressing obstacles that stand in the way of our mission. This month, we're focusing on how music might be used in forensic settings and during incarceration. And so our panel includes Allison Etter, who's a music therapist working at Kerrville State Hospital, serving individuals on a forensic commitment, such as those who were found not guilty by reason of insanity. Welcome, Allison. And she is joined by ethnomusicologist Benjamin Harbert, who directed the film Follow Me Down, Portraits of Louisiana Prison Musicians, and who is also an associate professor at Georgetown University. Welcome, Ben. It's great to have you both. So Ben, I wanted to start by asking you to tell us a little bit about the Follow Me Down project. How did you get interested in, listening or documenting music in this particular prison and in prisons in general?
Sure, and thanks for having me here. I'm looking forward to this discussion with everyone. I directed and produced a documentary film on music in Louisiana prisons, in part as an update on the long history of folkloric attention on folk songs. So I knew the song Goodnight Irene, the Midnight Special, Rock Island Line, all these songs that were that came from Southern prisons in the 1920s and beyond. But when I started looking at the history of folk music, I realized we don't have much representation of current music in prisons out there. And certainly people who are incarcerated today aren't singing these old folk songs from the 1920s. So the project really started from pure curiosity of what does it sound like in prison today? And wanting an update and there not being one. I was aware of the fact that the prison population had grown to an astronomical size. But I found it odd that we didn't really know what people were singing about. And as an ethnomusicologist, I look at singing as being a really important part of not only expressing your contemporary situation, but also as a way of understanding your contemporary situation. So it was less, the first stage was to collect, but the other one is to really think about what role music has in prisons today. That's the short answer of the question.
Yeah, that reminds me of a conversation I had with a person named B.L. Sherrill, who is now the deputy director of Die Jim Crow Records. It's a record label that produces music by people who are currently or formerly incarcerated. And she described to me that when she herself was incarcerated, it was such a dehumanizing experience that she wasn't in touch with her emotions until she started to sing, and she started to kind of find her identity, find herself again through music. I wonder if that is something that resonated with, as you were documenting these musicians. Is that something you noticed amongst others, or what were your, what did you see as sort of the reasons why they made music while they were incarcerated?
And the reasons, there's so many reasons why, just like on the outside in the free world, there's so many reasons that people play music. Some play music because it's part of their the way that they express family, or for some people, it's a way that they engage with their religious community. In others, it's a way of feeling some sense of career and success. And so in prison, there are also a variety of different reasons that people go to music and find music. And there are all sorts of debates among prisoners and musicians, just like there are out here, of whether people are doing it for the right reasons. You certainly find that in religious music settings of people, the debate between, are you singing for yourself? Are you singing for God? There's also in the secular world, the idea of, are we feeling it together, or are you trying to get yours? And so there are a number of reasons why, but success is different in there, because for a lot of them, success is not successfully releasing an album and playing a huge stadium tour. Success is connecting to someone on the outside who might help them with their case, right? Or success might be a way of publicly displaying themselves as somebody who's not defined by the actions that got them in. I'm a singer, not a murderer. Or they can express maybe a sensitive side to them in a hypermasculine world. So there's so many reasons, and I feel like as I've been doing this for many years, I'm constantly finding new reasons that people find music to be worth it. But I'll add this, that it's so hard to be a musician in prison. It takes so much effort to be able to gain access to, say, rehearsal space, to get an officer to unlock a door, to get an instrument in there, that usually when people are active musicians, there are a lot of reasons and a lot of understood value that the administration or guards have, and things like that. So it's overlapping. There's some similar reasons, and also some things really unique to the situation of incarceration.
So one of the people that you worked with and eventually published with, and who we were hoping to have on our webinar today, but who couldn't make it ultimately, is Consuela Gaines, who led a choir in a correctional institution. So why don't you tell us a little bit about meeting Consuela, what led to this collaboration that ultimately resulted in a published academic paper?
Sure, and I'll say, there are some people who I've met in prisons who've gotten out, who cycle back in, and Consuela is someone who's not here because she's busy doing important things, not that she's part of that cycle that unfortunately a lot of people fall into. So Consuela is probably doing something around entrepreneurship or activism to restore voting rights for formerly incarcerated people, or things like that. So, but I can speak a bit about the way we've worked together. So Consuela was one of the first people that I spoke to at the Women's Correctional Institute in Louisiana. And the administration identified her because she was the director or the leader of the women's choir there. And at the women's prison, like many other women's prisons, there aren't as many musical opportunities as there are for men. There are a variety of reasons for that, but one of the main ways that women could be musical is singing in the religious choir, in the Christian choir there. So Consuela had become a leader there by a pretty extraordinary means, and she was convicted of breaking her boyfriend out of prison. She got him at the courthouse and ended up taking I think a journalist's car, and was on the run with her boyfriend she had broken out of right after his trial, and was caught 8 days later in Georgia. And she was given something crazy like 98 years in prison. And eventually for I don't remember, it might have been something for like attempted armed robbery or something like that. That's what they called it. But they just threw the book at her. And so she had worked to get her sentence reduced. So when I met her, she was facing 47 years in prison. And she had this calm about her. She had these people skills that any music director needs to work with people. She had this charm. She had this sort of calmness about her. And I just couldn't put together her 47-year sentence and her demeanor. And so finally, I just asked her, I said, well, what are you in for? And she explained it to me. And it was an extraordinary story of how she had gone from being, because of the nature of her crime, she was under intense scrutiny from the administration. They put her in lockdown, which is the jail within the jail, not living in dormitories, but living in an individual cell with access to outdoors for an hour a day. And she was there for 2 years. And then went into population, became the choir director. And so her story, there are a lot of extraordinary stories, but her story was just a really interesting one to follow. Plus, she's just a really amazing, nice person who was really helpful and great to talk to about her thoughts on music. So a balance of intrigue and expertise, I guess, brought us together while I was working on the film. And so she had gone from singing in solitary confinement and to leading the choir. So she eventually got out after good time there and reduced sentence and fighting in court. And she called me up. She'd already been on my film years before, so and I'd screened it there, and I'd seen her several times afterwards. She called me up to talk about what she's doing and what her plans are right after release. And I hung up the phone and then remembered that I had just been asked to write a piece about music in prisons in lockdown. And then I remembered Consuela had just told me that she'd been writing for the Prison News magazine. And I called her right back and I said, hey, do you want to co-write something? And I think it's really important to take advantage of formerly incarcerated people who find courage to speak. And I think we need to take political advantage of people who have the experience of incarceration, who've suffered that, and to find ways of speaking with them. Mm. And so that was sort of the challenge. And I asked her if she was up for it. She said, sure. And so we've shared a Google document over several months and got on the phone, and we basically put her story of why singing in solitary confinement mattered. And I did the work of tying it to the literature and the studies and issues of mental health in prisons. And she told the direct story, and through that back and forth of like big context, theory, big picture, and granular detail of like what it was like to be there, it made for a piece of scholarship that I felt really great about, and I think she felt really great about. So that's the story. So we continue to speak. She comes into my class when COVID's up. We're going to try to bring her up to DC and support her work that she's doing now.
Yeah, that's great, and that's one of the ways in which I discovered you, and it's a great paper. We'll put it on our clearinghouse at the Sound Health Networks. People can find it more easily. So, Allison, I wondered if we could bring you into the conversation. So Ben is an ethnomusicologist in the music department in the performing arts world, and you're a music therapist. So tell us a little bit about the kinds of settings that music therapists generally are able to work in when it comes to people who, I guess you don't, in the forensic settings in a forensic hospital, I guess you don't say that they're incarcerated. I'm not sure whether that's the right term, but why don't you tell me, tell us what is the right way to think about this?
So music therapists work in a variety of settings. I always tell everybody that anywhere that you would find a speech therapist or a rec therapist or physical therapist, any other type of therapist, you would also sometimes find another creative arts therapist, like a music therapist. So we work in settings with children with disabilities, with adults with mental health needs, nursing homes, hospice, school settings with kids, in the NICU with infants. So pretty much everywhere. It's a very, very diverse populations. And with my situation at the hospital, I work with individuals under forensic care. So that means that they are individuals that are under some sort of court commitment. So our residents have a mental illness and they've been involved with the legal system and have been found not guilty by reason of insanity. And I've learned a little bit about that from our forensic conferences that I've attended. And I don't know the statistics for other parts of the country, but for Texas, apparently the not guilty by reason of insanity plea is only brought up in 1% of all criminal cases. And it's only successful 25% of that 1%. So it's very rare. It's far more likely that you'll find someone with a mental illness in a prison setting who's been found guilty. So it's a very, very small population. And so we serve individuals who are found not guilty by reason of insanity. We also, other facilities in Texas, and our facility used to have individuals who were preparing for their trial. So they were considered by the court to be incompetent to stand trial, which means they've been accused of a crime and they have not yet had their fair trial. So we don't know if they're guilty or not guilty by reason of insanity. And so they're sent to a facility to receive medication and care, get stable on their medications, and learn how to work with their lawyer so that they can have a fair trial and continue with their case. So it's very different from a prison setting. We don't have any inmates. We don't have any guilty people. It's not guilty by reason of insanity. So this is, they're acquitted. And instead of being sentenced to serve time for whatever the crime was, they are sent to us for treatment, and they receive medication, and we have educational courses for them, and art and music therapy, which is what I do with our art therapist. And so we just provide different programming for them to help them in their recovery and return to the community. And so that's what we do.
So when they first come into the hospital, do they have a sense of how long the treatment is expected to take? And like, are there milestones that they meet or reach? And or is it similar to what Ben was describing, where you're kind of committed for a particular period of time, and you know at the outset what that time is?
There is not a set time. That's probably the major difference. One of the major differences is they're not committed to our hospital for a certain period of time. Generally, it's a longer length of stay. I've been at the hospital 10 years now, and I've seen individuals leave after like 2 years. And I've seen individuals that have been there the entire time I've been there, and in some cases have been there much longer than I've been there. So all of that depends on the seriousness of their crime, how public their crime was, who their judge is. And in Texas, our judges are elected, so that makes a huge difference. And there's a lot of factors. So it's not just if they're doing well in their treatment and taking their medication. It's not a medical decision to release them from the hospital. it's a legal decision. And sometimes the doctors and the treatment team, they can advocate for the individuals and try to push the case along to help them succeed in outpatient care. But ultimately, it's up to the judge. So.
Yeah, I just think it's an interesting kind of dichotomy between sort of the work that you are doing, which is, I imagine based primarily in terms of treatment and bringing the person back to health, and the kind of this legal definition of when they are able to be considered healthy enough to return to the outside population.
Yeah, and I think that's frustrating for a lot of our folks, that they, it's something that they don't really maybe have a lot of control over. And that's one of the things I noticed in the chapter from Consuela and Benjamin, is the lack of control, and how music is used to kind of regain some of that control. When there's so many things taken away, so many things that, you don't have the choice or control over, but you can still participate in music programming or sing, or have some sort of control over your environment, your enjoyment. And so that's what I try to focus on in my role, and just providing those opportunities for our musicians. So, yeah.
Yeah, the issue of sort of a personal locus of control is so closely tied. A lot of psychologists now are sort of recognizing the importance of that in terms of mitigating stress and anxiety and various other aspects of our mental health. And that also struck me in that chapter by Ben and Consuela. And it's also very similar, I think, to how a lot of people use music, regardless of the settings in which they find themselves. I mean, sometimes, we use music in rituals in part to control the emotional work that we need to do to, say, grieve the loss of a loved one. I mean, I think, we want to cry at funerals when the music comes on. We specifically program sad music that will make us cry, in part so that we can have some control over this emotion that we need to work through. I wonder, this would be a question for either of you. Is that sort of emotional work part of like what you witnessed in terms of how music is used in these settings? Or is it more about self-expression and finding a voice that sort of maybe is not so closely, because I imagine being emotionally vulnerable in these settings is very dangerous, potentially too, since, being incarcerated is a dangerous place to be. So I don't know, I just thought I'd open it up to either of you if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think both of those things apply in my work. And I mean, definitely the self-expression, that's a really important part of being able to express yourself in a situation like this. But I also, sometimes I'll do individual therapy or group therapy, small groups. So we do have that confidentiality where it is safe to be vulnerable, or maybe safer. And so we have that opportunity to really dig into those emotions. And sometimes we'll do songwriting, lyric discussion, and sometimes recording original music. And it's an opportunity to process a lot of the feelings, maybe some of the feelings tied to why the individual is at our hospital, why they, what happened, if, there's some trauma or anything going on in their personal life, being away from their family. That's a tough one for a lot of our folks. And so music is a great way to process a lot of that and express yourself. So it really is both for what I do at the hospital with our residents.
In my film, but besides Consuela, we had followed 3 women who were joining the choir, and they represented a lot of these differences that you're talking about. As far as expression, this woman Raquel, she music was very much centered around its expressive capacity. And she had written over 900 songs. I didn't believe her at first. And then I heard a few of her songs. And I said, I guess you have been busy. And she would write songs and sing them for the population in lockdown when she was there. And it was a way of her kind of shifting her emotional life, her intense emotional life, into songs and sort of turn them into things that she could share and reflect on, and archive and organize. And so for her, that was really important. Whereas for this woman, Thais, this young woman who had come in, she was so nervous about expressing herself emotionally because she didn't know who to trust. And she was new, and she didn't know if she confided in somebody, if that might get her in trouble at some point. And so she, needing some sort of emotional connection, found that the choir gave her a limited amount of people and an opportunity to trust people and just put something in a song and test it out, have a conversation with someone. And so for her, music in that moment, I'm sure it shifted as she went through, but in that moment, it was about kind of sharing, figuring out how to share this emotional world. And then this woman, Latasha, was, for her, it was just too much. And she was like, you know what, I'm just going to keep my head down. I'm going to get my GED and get out of here. I don't need the choir. It was just like, she didn't need that emotion. She didn't need that community. And I often find when people decide not to do music, that could be as illuminating as the moments when people do find to be music. So I think from that, we can say that music is tied in many different ways to the emotional life. But stepping back from that, to my work in men's prisons, I found that the ties to people's emotional lives tends to be gendered. In that, in the women's prison, the problem was the unexpected and chaotic emotional life that's out on the yard. And that's even from, like, the officers would sort of let it out. And there's this shared emotional world, and sometimes violent emotional world, in the women's prison. Whereas the men, and this is just exaggerating stereotypes we have on the outside, tended to keep everything in. And so for them, a lot of times music was the time to have a socially acceptable, in a men's setting, a socially acceptable moment to feel sad, or to express a hope that might seem unmanly or something, or to cry about a loved one dying, or to empathize and reach out to somebody in a song. So it was very much sort of an emotional desert in the men's prison that music helped. And it was an emotional chaos in the women's prison that music helped to mitigate or organize a bit. And I know I'm drawing broad strokes here, and it doesn't apply everywhere, but it's really interesting to see how that emotional world can be something that's very violent in different ways in both settings.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And it also underscores the fact that sometimes we think of as music as being universally a good thing. But we find, as we study it more deeply, there are contraindications. There are times when music can be harmful. And one of the ways in which I think it can be harmful is that it can lead to group cohesion, which also can lead to aggression towards people who are not then considered part of that group. I mean, I imagine, even within the setting of a choir, there are probably people who are in the choir and people who are not in the choir. And then I can imagine there being some tension, and I don't know, I wondered if you experienced or you witnessed anything related to, we hear often about gang affiliation, particularly within the men's incarceration, men's prisons, and how that's like a major problem and can lead to a lot of violence. And, I wonder if does music play a role in that, or, in terms of, segregating people into different groups? Was that something that was a thing, or was it just, really kind of, a small part of what is a much bigger problem?
Yeah, that's interesting. It's and I'd be interested to hear sort of Allison's experience with working with some of these musical concepts that operate to bring people together and exclude people and things like that. But from it works in all ways, in many ways, in complex ways with existing social structures that are in prisons, and those are often changing. And I've found that that music can sort of express divisions that are already there, right? Like especially racial divisions, like, the white guys listening to this and the black guys listening to this. And I just finished a manuscript for a book about music at Angola Prison over 100 years of music there. And one of the most rich sources I had was interviewing Charles Neville, who had done time there in the 1960s. And he talked about how, because the infrastructure was very austere, they all shared the same band room, but the white guys and the black guys wouldn't mix together. And there was a moment where they were battling, this is 1966 probably, where they were battling through sound systems, and the white guys were playing country music at full volume on their record player, and the black jazz musicians were blasting John Coltrane's Love Supreme back at them on the other side of it. And it was just this chaos of sound. But then on the other hand, he had this story about how he showed up one day, and this white guy who he'd never spoken to before, but had seen and was probably the one turning up the volume on the country music before, laid down a shiv, a handmade knife, on the table in front of him, and it said, "Hey, Charles, I need to talk to you. I've been told something wrong." And Charles was like, what's going on? What do you want to tell me about? And he said, I was taught my whole life by my school, by my family, by my church, that you people, meaning black people, weren't quite animals, but you weren't quite humans either, that you were somewhere in between. And he said, and then I watch you playing the saxophone, and I've been trying to figure out this guitar and I can't learn it. And you're teaching other people how to play instruments. And he said, so if your intellectual capacity is that much beyond mine, then something I was taught was wrong. And we got to figure this out. And they essentially, that launched this discussion that they had that was sort of decolonizing, in our terms now, decolonizing sort of the racial divisions and assumptions that they had. And like those are the wonderful music moments for us, where it can disrupt, that music, that Charles's virtuosity and his ability to do this disrupted notions of division before. But then again, in that same story, music was also used to I know you hate this music, so I'm going to play it at volume 10 across the room. So it operates on both ways. But I do appreciate those moments, and people were very quick to talk about how a goal of theirs was to try to reach across with their style of music, reach across to somebody who didn't necessarily like hip hop, say, or somebody who didn't like rock and roll, and to get them to move with it was extraordinarily meaningful to them. And so, that made me really focus on what are these things about music that allow us to sort of feel something together. And I'm sure Allison puts these into operation on a daily basis, but I think of like the basic, our human capacity to feel a beat together, right? And I've learned from some people who study more the evolutionary aspects of music about how that's a unique human capacity to be able to feel a beat together. That like dogs don't do it. They wag their tails and they bark, but they don't do it together, and they don't feel it together. They don't anticipate the next beat. But there are all these ways that I think music does these things where it allows us to feel together, that it opens up a space of intersubjectivity, a place where it's not you and me, it's we with that. And so it's things like that, following a structure of a song, basic things of following a beat, seem to be what music can offer, to do these things that either bind us together against people or bind us together despite our differences.
Allison, I wonder if you could walk us through a little bit about what it would be like let's say you meet a new resident and now you're trying to decide what therapy would be most effective, what to do. And is this a decision that you make with their medical team? Is it something that the resident themselves asks for? I just wonder how this whole process works.
So it can be all of the above. Sometimes I get referrals from the treatment team or a member of the treatment team. Sometimes the folks come up to me and tell me they want to be in music classes. And so it kind of depends where, I guess, who gets there first. But yeah, so I usually just meet with someone and figure out what their interests are, like what types of music they like to listen to, if they have any experience playing any instruments or performing, and just kind of what their goals are. Their goals are in therapy and personally, but also what their goals are as far as music goes. And I like that Ben mentioned the us and them kind of part of it, because that's where our performances really, I think, make a huge difference in our hospital. We have a lot of residents that were musicians before they came to the hospital, or have really excelled in their music since they've been at the hospital. And so we have performance opportunities, we have a band. And so it really puts them in a position where they're the expert, they're the performer, they're a musician, not a patient or anything like that. It kind of blurs those lines of us and them, or patients and staff. And so they get the chance to kind of show off their skills. And so I think it really makes a difference when I get a referral from the treatment team to see someone, and then the doctor or someone on the treatment team attends our performances or a talent show and gets to see them on stage performing. And it's a reminder that it's more than just someone that is here for whatever their crime was. It's someone that is a musician and a performer, and it kind of puts them in a different light, and changes that assumption of what what others may think of them prior to the performance. And so it's really cool.
So is most of the music therapy work in these settings facilitating these kinds of group music making sessions, or is it more one-on-one, the way it would be, say, in a more traditional hospital setting?
It's both right now because of COVID. It's one-on-one a lot of the time, but for safety. But under normal circumstances, it's both. I try to incorporate in group and individual. Some goals are more appropriate for one-on-one work, and then for performances, sometimes it's better to have a group and have a whole band or a whole choir performing. And so there's definitely benefits to both, so I do whatever's best at the time.
Mm-hmm. And do you find that overall the kind of morale and the just general well-being of residents is improved by having performances in those settings, or is the benefit really limited to the participants in the group music making? Like, do you see a halo effect, I guess is what I'm asking, when you have a performance? Does the whole place kind of get their spirits lifted, or is it really limited to the people who are on stage?
I think it really changes the culture of our hospital. Our whole rehab department at the hospital is amazing, and we get together and put on these events, and with everybody working together, musicians, artists, staff, everyone. And so it kind of creates this sense of community of everybody coming together, and it's like a normal social, cultural experience where it's like you're attending an art show or a music concert with your peers and your community, and it just kind of spreads throughout the hospital. And like we've had community art shows where artists are showcasing their work, and we have our band or our choir perform, or we'll have like open mic or something. And so it's a community-wide event. And I think it definitely catches on throughout the hospital, because we will have our musicians and our artists perform or showcase their work, and then we'll have others that are a little bit quieter, maybe in the background, come in and be like, hey, can you show me how to do that? Can you teach me how to play guitar? Or I want to learn how to do this too. And so it kind of spreads from there. And we've also noticed that that's created opportunities for mentorship. We've had a lot of our musicians, our residents, who have used their skills to teach their peers. We've had individuals teach piano lessons, voice lessons. In the art studio, they've had workshops for a variety of media. And it's just really an important opportunity for our artists and musicians to be in that position where they're helping others. They're breaking down those barriers of us and them, or patient and staff. We're changing their role, really. It's a community of artists and musicians learning together, and there's not really that hierarchy of staff or everybody's just artists or musicians learning from each other, which is really cool. So it's definitely spread throughout the hospital, and that kind of happened organically. That's not something that I pushed, or our art therapist, Jamie, it's not something that she's pushed. It's just kind of happened. And I mean, we've kind of supported it along the way, but it just kind of happened organically from the community that's established at our hospital.
That kind of reminds me of some work by the music producer Ian Brennan, who created an album in a prison in Malawi called the Zomba Prison Project. And in it, when he first went there, there was a resident band that had been made up both of prison guards and people who were incarcerated. And he felt like he really wasn't interested in the music that they played, because it felt a little bit coercive to him. Like it didn't feel genuine from the part of the people who were incarcerated, because there was this sense of like, you know, there's this hierarchical power differential between different members of the band. And so like, how can you really, you know, be free to create the kind of music that you want to when the person who basically has your life in their hands is on bass guitar. And I thought that was a really interesting thing that he noticed. It might not be as big a problem in a forensic setting where there isn't maybe this, you know, big dichotomy between, say, a guard and a resident. But it probably is true in the more traditional prisons that you're familiar with. Were there any cases in which you saw music making that happened that included people of these different hierarchies?
There are cases historically at Angola where officers have had a role in the different bands. There was a guy named Bobby Howard who played saxophone, and he was an officer there in I think maybe as early as the 60s through 70s. And he ended up in a number of bands there. and it's a bit of a two-way street, because yeah, there might be some coercion, there might be some issues of power there for sure, but there are also opportunities for the musicians to have access to, say, now they have an ally who's in an administrative meeting, or who has some power over a guard who might be able to speak to it. So it can be an asset as much as it can be a liability. But I think one of the terms I've found useful for looking for some of these issues is by Leo Chiolidis, I think is how you pronounce his name. And he uses the term decorative justice to describe the way that some art programs can be used to mask a lot of the violence and systematic problems with our criminal justice system. So for instance, when a warden puts forward a group of Black men singing about Jesus, and we're moved by it, but we don't see what happens when they go to bed that night, or when they wake up the next morning, or when they're alone, or we don't have access to the moment during their court date when they were disenfranchised somehow or something. In other words, all of these non-dramatic, everyday, ordinary moments of violence can get obscured when we are moved by music. And I don't think the argument is, so then we shouldn't have music because it's distracting, because it certainly has value, as Allison was attesting to, of making prison seem, at least momentarily, more normal or bearable or something like that. So I think that term is useful, at least to caution how we interpret, how we attend to musical performances by people who are incarcerated, or people who are in situations where people have power over them. Because we don't want justice to be decorative. We want it to be permanent. We want it to be an everyday boring thing, not just a dramatic thing that happens in a moment. But Consuela talked about that. We put that in the article about how she's saying her singing put her in much more familiar terms with one of the officers who was there. And so that ability to feel something together, I think the question is, what do you do with it? How do you use that? And for a lot of the people who I spoke to in about the music in Angola, where I was able to ask more questions than I did during the film, what was interesting is that any aspect of music making involved some sort of negotiation of power. Every single thing, whether it's rehearsal, whether it's a performance, whether it's getting a book, whether it's getting an instrument fixed, all of that involved some kind of negotiation of power. And so that being a musician made your networks, it expanded all your networks. In the same way that being a musician here, you got to know the people who run the venues. You got to know the people who work at the music shops. You got to know the people who do your taxes and all these boring things, right? It creates a lot of weak ties and strong ties that allow you to have more agency. So it's interesting that Ian's idea of freedom is something away from other people's power. But I found the people in Angola, they had freedom because they had relationships with people in different situations of power. They had relationships with the administrator, they had relationships with the music teachers, with the outside people, with the outside groups who'd come in and get them. That those relationships were actually the things that gave people freedom, because the fundamental unfreedom is to have no one you can rely on, to have no one that you can ask a question to. It's to be totally isolated and alone. That's an unfreedom.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's I think that's a really interesting and important point. It also made me wonder about the difference between vocal music versus instrumental music. And it seems to me like the barrier to making music is lower if all you need is your own voice. But by the same token, it's a much more vulnerable position to be in when you're singing rather than playing an instrument, right? It's really opening up yourself. So I wonder if either of you have a comment about that, this distinction between the ease with which you can make music using your voice, but then also the vulnerability that comes with it. Allison, do you find like primarily it's easier to get your residents to sing or to play instruments, or what's your experience?
I have an easier time getting everybody to learn instruments. I think, I mean, it was interesting to read in the chapter that Consuela mentioned that they didn't have access to instruments. So I feel like we were very fortunate to have a variety of instruments available for our musicians to use in music classes and also on the units where they live. So it's really, really important that they have that. I think, and I'm not a vocalist primarily, so I would definitely agree with the whole vulnerable side of singing. And so I think that's something, whenever I have a resident a musician who wants to work on singing, it's kind of like, all right, we're in this together. This is hard, this is vulnerable, and we're gonna get better together. We're gonna work on this, we're gonna do vocal exercises. It's gonna sound awful, and it's gonna be out of our range, and we're gonna do it anyways because that's the only way through. So I think that's definitely a lot more challenging than learning an instrument. And in a lot of cases, learning an instrument, it's an external thing. So if your hand is in the right place on guitar, you're pretty much gonna get the right note. With singing, you can't tell if you're in the right place, and you can't see what's going on in there and why you are not matching pitch. So it's a lot, it's very different. But yeah, I usually have an easier time with something, with like learning an instrument, but occasionally I will get someone who is very comfortable in their voice and they're like, let's just record it, let's do it. And they are very talented and very professional in the recording studio, and it's just a one take thing. So it really depends, but yeah, for the most part, singing is tough.
Yeah, that's something that Ian, you can see it in the in sort of, there's a documentary, CNN documentary, I think, or about the making of his Grammy nominated album from this prison. And especially amongst the women, you first see that none of them wanted to get up in front of the mic. And then once one person did, that kind of like the floodgates just opened, and people just came and they just released these amazing, completely new songs that they had created. If people want to hear from Consuela and more from Ben, and also from Ian and BL Sherelle, as I mentioned earlier, there are 2 episodes of my podcast Cadence, in which we cover music in prisons and features all of these different voices. It's season 3, towards the end of the season, last couple of episodes. You can find it on Spotify or iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. And we have a couple questions now coming in. Dennis is asking, where can someone view Follow Me Down? So Ben, why don't you give us some of that info?
Yeah, so it's available on, the distributor is Films for the Humanities and Sciences, and the streaming portal for it is called Films on Demand. And so that's the type of thing, they're an educational distributor. So you can find them as a streaming service at libraries primarily. They do sell individual DVDs, which sounds so ancient at this point. But if you call Films for Humanities and Sciences and ask for it, they have a home rate that's much more reasonable than the other rates. And people should feel free to send me a note if they're interested, and I can give them more details on it.
Yeah, I certainly know the DVDs are useful if you're an educator because most classrooms are still equipped with DVD players. SA Symphony Orchestra is asking, how can nonprofit arts organizations such as symphony orchestras best support the work to expand music therapy efforts in prisons and in forensic settings? Allison, do you have any ideas about where the resources are needed and how they might be able to support you?
I can't speak for prisons. I don't know exactly what the protocol is, but I know for us, like we've received donations of instruments from a couple nonprofits, the Ukulele Kids Club, and then the Chin Guitar Project. We've received donations, and that's been really helpful because it's allowed us to continue that one-on-one work, and our musicians get to have an instrument to play during groups. I think also just some sort of performance or I know that's tough right now because a lot of places aren't allowing visitation, but we love having outside performers come into our hospital to perform for our residents. So that's always really great to just kind of have that opportunity. And because of COVID and safety right now, I know that that's not really able to happen, but maybe just some sort of outreach program to like participate in live streams if there's internet access, like to view performances. A lot of performances are going online these days, so that's something that's helpful. I'll have to think about that more. I haven't really thought about outreach opportunities, but
I mean, I think your point of donating instruments is really well taken. It sounds like access to instruments is a major barrier in a lot of these places, and that having an instrument might make it easier for people to participate. Dennis is asking,
if I could chime in on there too for a few resources. I'd suggest first looking at the Justice Arts Coalition run by Wendy Jason. And she has a national database of arts programs in prisons that would be really useful. Most prisons, you'd have to approach the prison or go through the state. Most people are in state institutions, so it's a state by state thing. The largest organization running is the one in California, no surprise. And the William James Association would be an organization to reach out to if you wanted to partner with somebody in California, and they have access to dozens of institutions around there and are very well organized. And then for orchestral music or Western art music and strings, Music Cambia is an organization that does a lot of that work and runs programs where people learn and also compose for orchestral music. So those three I'd look for.
Those are great resources. I know there's also Rehabilitation Through the Arts is another program that helps. And I know
New York.
Yeah, and there are a couple of chamber music groups like Dakota, and there's another one in California too that already have connections, and I think that's a big barrier is getting in. So I'm going to, we're getting to the top of the hour. And if you're joining us live, right after this, come to our virtual networking platform. It's soundhealth.vfairs.com. That's V as in Victor, FAIRS. And you'll meet Samora Pinderhughes, who is a composer, a multimedia artist, for a preview of The Healing Project, which is a forthcoming digital archive music album and exhibition that explores the daily realities of violence, incarceration, detention, and policing in communities across the US and highlights healing and care strategies. So join us for a conversation with Samora and a preview of his upcoming exhibition. You can also check out our newsletter on our website that includes some of the papers that we've been talking about and an interview with Consuela Gaines. And you can find that on our website under the tab newsletter. Allison and Ben, thank you so much for being on this webinar.
Well, thank you so much. And Allison, it's nice to be in a room with you. I love what you do.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. And I love learning about everything you and Consuela have done through the chapter and today.
And to learn more about the Sound Health Network and to take advantage of our resources, including our clearinghouse of papers, our affinity groups, and our virtual networking platform, please visit our website, soundhealth.ucsf.edu. And you can engage with us through our social media accounts at Sound Health Net on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And of course, watch other archive video content on our YouTube channel. And our next webinar will be in February. We'll be talking about music improvisation and its therapeutic applications. Hope to see you on VFairs, and if not, at the next webinar. Thank you both.